Welcome to the Network Engineering Video Blog. I'm your host, Michael Crane. So is neg48 a mystery to you? Have you ever wanted to buy a piece of equipment, used or new, that only had neg48 power supplies? Well, if so, you might be interested in this blog, because today we're going to look at powering a neg48 piece of equipment. And in the industry, if you're in the industry, it is not minus 48, it is neg48. So whenever you're talking to someone, usually in the telecom or maybe data centers have some of this stuff, mainly telecom though, when you're talking to someone, do not say minus 48 volts, they will laugh at you. It is neg48. So anyway, what do we got going here? So a while back, you can see one of my previous blogs, I picked up a Juniper M5 router off eBay for real cheap, but it had neg48 power supplies in it, and I only need to do one side. I don't really need to power both sides because I don't really care about having redundant power supplies. The router needs, I don't know, 14 amps or something like that max, or that's the max that this power supply will draw. And so I needed a power supply, you know, getting close to that. So I picked up a Meanwell SE600-48. And if you look at the spec sheet on it, it says it's a plus 48 volt power supply. You might be thinking, well, that's not going to work. We need neg48. Well, we'll get to that here in just a second. Back to the power requirements. So this does about 12 amps, and it pulls about 7 amps on the AC side. And you know, for all you guys in other countries that have 220 or 230 volt power, this isn't going to really apply to you, but it's going to be fairly similar. So okay, let's see here. So I picked up the Meanwell, and one of the things about the Meanwell that I liked about it is the outputs are what's called floating, and what floating means, and it's floating. And what floating means is that this line is not referenced to ground, which and some power supplies, negative and ground are tied together, right? Or this line is not referenced to ground, and that could be in the case of a power supply that says it is neg48. Okay, so I got this power supply. I knew it was floating, and you can kind of tell if you look on the block diagram for this, is it kind of has this going on. And by the way, if you don't know, these are the symbols for ground, and this is a symbol for a capacitor. And so you can see that there's a cap in here, a decoupling cap, that's actually decoupling the lines from ground. Okay? And if you need to know more about stuff like that, I suggest you watch the Electronics Engineering Video Blog with Dave Jones. So anyway, okay, so we've got our floating power supply, and so let's just start from this side of the board and work our way across this way. Oh, by the way, this is 12 amps or something. It's 600 watts. That's what that 600 means. It's I don't know. It's approximately 12 amps at 48 volts. Okay. Yeah, sorry, that's kind of hard to read, but you understand. Okay, so a quick note about when you're working with neg48 is and using your multimeter. Of course, everything on the multimeter is, you know, plus minus. And you really need to change your nomenclature, or what you call your probes. And for this blog, we're going to refer to the red probe as feed and the black probe as return. It is not plus minus. It's feed and return. And you do that, if you don't do that, you will undoubtedly hook something up backwards and release the magic smoke out of either your Juniper router or your Meanwell power supply, or both. And I kind of wrote it down here so you can see return, feed. Be careful when you're working on any kind of mains electricity, and even the neg 48. Yeah, it's only 48 volts, but it's also at 12 amps. So you have to be careful. And oh, another safety thing, and I'll go over some other safety things later, but is when you're working on power supplies, you should not wear any jewelry, because you don't want anything dangling or getting your fingers caught in between a couple terminals there. You will not enjoy that experience. When you're testing something for floating, you test, basically you just put your, and it doesn't matter which way when you're testing, you know, put your meter on ohms, you're testing continuity, right? Yeah, okay, so 0.2 ohms, that's a direct short. So on the plus, or on the return to ground, if your meter displays something like that, like open line, that's good. And then you do the same thing for the feed side, or the negative terminal to ground, and you should see open line. Right, so that means there's nothing connecting either one of these to ground, like I was showing you earlier. So in the US, it's 115 volts AC. Make sure the Meanwell is set to 115 volts, because it'll do 115 or 230. Put your voltmeter on AC, and well, you don't have to test the mains, you probably know it works. So but you want the black going to line. Now this is US, remember. Green is normally ground, and white is normally your common or neutral. So if you're looking at a plug, the round part is going to be your ground. The neutral is usually the longer slot. The neutral is usually the longer slot on the plug, and then the hot side is going to be the smaller slot. Video sped up showing me put all this together, so you'll see how I did it. And this ground connects to the Meanwell, to the power supply, to this symbol right here, which is, you know, the ground symbol, and it basically is just grounding excuse me, the enclosure. Feed, return. Right, so we want to feed negative 48 volts, and you'll see me do this in the video. So of course, put your voltmeter on DC, right? Because this is DC, and you just test across it. And so you put the red on the feed and the black on the return, right? And you should see neg 48 come across. All right. And so then you just tie, and the standard in at least the telecom sites I've been in is to use blue for the neg 48 feed, and then they use black on the neg 48 return. And that is very backwards to the way the mains wiring is done in the US anyway, where they have black is hot and white is your neutral. So don't get these confused, okay? Okay, so let's talk about the grounding. So the Meanwell, the enclosure is going to be grounded by the earth ground, or this green wire going to the round conductor and on your mains. And And there is no ground on this side of it, right? Because these are floating. It doesn't care. The enclosure is grounded. However, on the Juniper, you will also see on the power supplies, you will see the neg 48 feed and then the return. And they actually call it return, which is good. But you will need to ground your chassis, and they have big boxes with exclamation points telling you to ground your chassis. Now in my situation, my rack is already tied to ground, so when I bolt this thing in the rack, it will be grounded. If you're going to set this on a shelf, however, or any piece of equipment like that, and it's going to be sitting on a shelf and not screwed down to your grounding plane, you need to run a wire from wherever the ground point is on your piece of equipment to a ground. Either on your rack, you can ground it to the earth ground. I mean, you could run a wire from here all the way to over here if you want. Okay, so before I show you that video of me assembling all this sped up 8 times, so it's not too boring, I wanted to go over some last minute safety notes, and I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget them because they're important. So the first thing is like I said earlier, no jewelry, no rings, no chains, nothing that can dangle, no watches, because you don't want to be working on this and accidentally get your finger on one of these lugs, and it will literally heat a ring up and do some real damage. So that's bad. Plus, it's not good for your equipment either. You need a good multimeter. Be very careful working on mains wiring using a cheap, $20 multimeter. That's very dangerous. These have all kinds of built-in safeties, and they're not going to blow up in your hands if you stick it on amps and then hit and try to measure voltage. Okay. When you order, if you don't order a main well power supply, or even if you do order a main well power supply, be sure to test it to make sure that these outputs right here are floating. Okay, like I showed earlier, make sure that these are floating, because if you get a power supply where this negative is actually tied to ground, that means it's referenced to ground, and you will be sending plus 48 volts in your return side, and that's going to be a real bad thing for your piece of equipment. Another thing is, when you're connecting the mains and all these connectors for that matter, you need to make sure you get some good crimp-on terminals and heat shrink. These have the heat shrink built in, built onto them, but you can just get, crimp-on terminals and put your own heat shrink on if you want, but make sure they're good quality ones. Don't get the cheap ones. When you go to power this thing up, make sure you're wearing safety glasses, and you might stand back a little bit just in case, but hopefully you won't have that problem. And the last thing, but not least, is make sure that before you put any kind of power on this, everything is grounded properly. Well, ground, everything, all these chassis, everything needs to be grounded before you power this up, because if there's any kind of short in your equipment and it's shorting the enclosures, you do not want to turn into the return side. Believe me, that will ruin your day, and especially on mains earth. This will feed easily 20 amps at 115 volts through you, and that will definitely ruin your day. Another thing I wanted to mention is when you're testing to see if these are tied to ground, make sure that there's nothing connected to it. These should be open. So when you're ohming across the negative terminal and the enclosure, you don't want any wires tied to it. This needs to be open, and definitely do not have it powered on. Anytime you're using you're testing it for connectivity to ground, yeah, make sure nothing is powered on. You should be testing this floating part right when it comes out of the box. Okay. Stay tuned for the video of me assembling all this. It's sped up 8 times. I don't know how long it's going to last. But if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.